The sand moved. Kane Mercer almost missed it. He was 3 hours into his shift cataloging geological anomalies along the impact corridor, and his eyes had gone the particular kind of numb that happens when you've been staring at Arizona desert floor long enough that your brain stops expecting anything interesting to happen, which it wouldn't, which it hadn't, for 6 months. Which was precisely why the government had assigned him here, to this particular stretch of nowhere 40 miles outside Sedona, cataloging rocks for a department that had already decided he wasn't worth the trouble of a real posting. The sand moved again. Not the wind. The wind had died an hour ago, and the air over the Kessler Basin sat dead and heavy in the late afternoon heat. What moved was beneath the surface, a small, rhythmic shift, like something breathing at a depth of maybe 4 feet, and the sand above it rising and falling in time. Kane crouched. He was 41 years old, with the kind of lean that comes from spending too much time outdoors and not enough time eating, and a face that had been weathered into something that looked perpetually skeptical. He had a doctorate in xenobiology from MIT, which was either impressive or pathetic depending on how you felt about a field of science with no confirmed subject matter. He'd been top of his class. He'd published 12 papers. He'd spent 8 years at JPL doing theoretical work on potential extraterrestrial biochemistry, and then he'd spent the following 3 years being quietly humiliated out of relevance when a project he'd championed, an atmospheric analysis protocol for potential biosignature detection, had been adopted by the military and subsequently classified, with his name removed from everything, and then cited publicly as the work of a Colonel Harmon Staves who had not, to Kane's knowledge, ever taken a biology class. He'd requested reassignment. They'd given him Arizona. He pressed his palm flat against the sand and felt it again. Rise, fall, rise, fall. Kane opened his pack and pulled out an extraction probe, a narrow titanium rod with a sensor cluster at the tip, standard geological survey equipment. He pushed it into the sand 4 inches to the left of the movement zone and checked the readout. Temperature differential, 9 degrees warmer than ambient. Atmospheric compound trace at depth, nitrogen-rich, not unusual for desert substrate, except the reading spiked, then stabilized, then spiked again, in a pattern that precisely matched the movement above it. Something down there was breathing nitrogen. Kane sat back on his heels for a moment and looked at the sky. It was that particular shade of blue that happens just before the light starts going orange, and there was a hawk turning lazy circles about 300 feet up, and there was nothing else. No vehicles, no radio chatter, just him and the desert and whatever was buried 4 feet under his boots. He thought about calling it in. He thought about what would happen after he called it in. He picked up his entrenching tool and started to dig. He went carefully. Whatever was down there was breathing, which meant it could also be harmed, and he was a scientist, and scientists did not dig like they were in a hurry when there was something alive beneath them. He went 4 inches at a time, checking the probe readings, moving the sand sideways rather than up. The temperature gradient increased. At 18 inches down, he found the first edge of it, a smooth curved surface, dark as basalt, almost 2 feet across where the probe touched it. Not rock. The surface was slightly warm and had the faint give of something composite. A hull fragment or a pod. At 28 inches, he found the edge of what the pod was doing. There was a split along one seam, maybe 3 inches wide, and from that split at 4-hour intervals, it was releasing a pulse of pressurized nitrogen, a mechanical breath, an automated life support rhythm, still running on whatever power source had survived impact. The pod had been here at least 6 days. Kane knew because the impact corridor he'd been cataloging corresponded to a low-altitude entry event that had shown up on 2 different radar stations as a ballistic anomaly and been subsequently classified as a weather instrument anomaly by Colonel Staves's office. 6 days. He worked faster. The pod came clear at 3 feet down, and it was roughly the size of a compact car, teardrop-shaped, with a surface that absorbed light rather than reflecting it. The seam ran along its entire length. There were stress fractures along the upper side, re-entry damage maybe, or impact. The bottom half was intact. The thing had hit the basin at a low angle and skipped, losing speed, and buried itself under the loose upper sand like a thrown stone burying itself in water. Kane found the manual release by accident. He was running his fingers along the seam, looking for a hinge point, when something clicked under his thumb and the entire top half of the pod side opened like a clam. The smell hit him first, cold and sharp, like the inside of a very clean laboratory, nitrogen-rich and slightly ozone-tinged. Then the light inside the pod resolved, and Kane went absolutely still. She was pressed into the lower half of the pod, buried from the neck down in a dense packing material that had the color and consistency of dark amber resin. Only her head was above it. Her eyes were open, large, black from edge to edge, no visible iris or white, though Kane would later learn to read the subtle pressure changes in the fluid that served those functions, and they were fixed on him with an expression that he could not parse at all. Not fear, not hostility, something more fundamental. The assessment of a creature in absolute restraint, evaluating whether the thing looking at it is a threat. She was not human. The face was humanoid in structure, bilateral symmetry, forward-facing eyes, a nose with 2 vertical slits for nostrils, a mouth with thin lips, but the proportions were off in ways that kept resolving and dissolving as his brain tried to file them. The jaw was slightly too long. The cranium was broader at the temples than at the crown. The skin was the color of deep water at dusk, blue-gray, with a faint luminescent quality in the shadows under her cheekbones. Along her jawline and what he could see of her neck, there were small raised marks in a precise pattern, not scarring. Too regular, deliberate, either tattoo or brand or something for which he did not have a human word. She had been buried to her neck. Not by the impact. The resin that held her was not a crash material. Kane had studied enough xenobiology theory to know what crash materials looked like. They conform to the body, absorb shock, release under thermal change. This resin held her in a fixed position. Her chin was slightly elevated. Her arms, wherever they were under the amber surface, were not in a protective posture. They were behind her. Restrained. Someone had put her in here like this. The pod hadn't crashed, it had been ejected, from something larger, at a trajectory that had carried it directly into the least observed corner of the American Southwest. Kane knelt at the edge of the pod and looked at her for a long moment. She looked back. "Okay," he said aloud, more to himself than to her. "You're in a situation. I'm going to help you get out of it. That's going to require me to touch the material around you, and I want you to know in advance that I have no idea what I'm doing and I'm making it up as I go." She said nothing. He hadn't expected her to. He reached in and pressed his thumb against the resin near her collarbone. It was firm but yielded slightly under pressure. He tested it along the edge near her left shoulder and found a seam in the resin itself, not natural. Applied in 2 sections, which meant it could be separated at that seam. It took him 40 minutes and most of the contents of his pack. The resin responded to acetone. He'd brought it for geological sample prep and to sustained mechanical pressure. He worked the seam apart millimeter by millimeter, talking the entire time in the low, steady voice he used when he was nervous, narrating what he was doing and why, not because she could understand him, but because the silence felt dangerous. At some point, she made a sound. One sound. Low and resonant, somewhere between a tone and a click. Kane stopped moving and waited. She made it again, differently inflected. He filed it away. When the resin separated enough, she pulled her own arms free. Her hands were 4-fingered, jointed differently at the knuckle, with nails the color of the pod's exterior. She got her hands in front of her and pressed them flat against the resin and pushed, and Kane grabbed the far edge of the split and pulled, and together they broke the restraint apart in one long crack that rang out over the desert like a rifle shot. She came up out of the pod in a single motion, vertical, controlled, no stagger, and then immediately went sideways as her legs didn't hold. Kane caught her. She was lighter than he expected. Her hands gripped his forearms with a strength that left marks. She was tall. Standing, she had 2 inches on him, and he wasn't short. She was wearing something, a garment that looked like it might once have been structured and was now torn in several places, a dark material that moved like liquid when she moved. Along her left side, from the bottom rib down to the hip, there was damage. Real damage. Something had hit her at an angle and left a wound that had partially closed on its own. The edges were knitting together even as he watched, the skin moving and reforming in tiny increments. Fast. Frighteningly fast. She was healing in real time. That's Kane started. She looked at him, then down at her own side, then at him again. She said 2 words in a language that had the texture of water over stones, and her face did something that might have been exhaustion. Or might have been something else entirely, for which he had no reference point. He helped her sit. She sat cross-legged in the sand next to the open pod, and he crouched across from her, and they looked at each other in the failing light, and Kane thought. She was a prisoner. She was transported in a restraint device. She was ejected in a pod over a populated planet with no means of communication and no apparent survival kit. She was injured, and someone had left her to die slowly, too slowly, given the healing rate, which maybe explained the design of the punishment. Keep her alive, keep her suffering, put her somewhere she can't call for help. Wait. You're not going to get to wait, Kane said, to no one in particular. He was already going through his pack for his sat phone. Then he stopped. The people who would respond to that call were the people who worked for Colonel Staves. He put the sat phone back. He pulled out his personal cell and called the one number he had for someone who wasn't those people. "Rays," said the voice on the other end. "It's Kane. I need your truck. I need you to not ask questions for about 20 minutes, and I need you to bring the medkit from the secondary cabinet, not the first aid one." A pause, then, "How bad?" Kane looked at the alien princess sitting in the sand under the Arizona stars, breathing carefully, watching him with those black eyes. "I don't know yet," he said. "Bring the truck." The truck came in an hour. Rays was a geological survey tech, 10 years younger than Kane, with a quality of absolute unflappability that Kane had spent 6 months being grateful for. He drove up, got out, looked at the situation and said, "She's not from around here." "No," Kane agreed. "Is she dangerous?" "She was restrained in a transport device. She's wounded. She hasn't moved toward me in a hostile way." "That's not exactly a no." "Bring the medkit." They got her into the back seat of the truck. She allowed it. She watched everything with a focused stillness that Kane recognized from field work, the stillness of something conserving energy, building information, not yet committing to a response. She was smart. He didn't know how he knew that, but he did. The medkit was comprehensive because Kane had put it together himself after the standard issue 1 had proven useless for field work. He had wound irrigation equipment, butterfly closures, topical antiseptics, and a portable ultrasonography wand that he'd bought secondhand for checking on geological samples and had never once used for that purpose. He used it now. He pressed it against her side, where the wound was, and looked at the image. He saw the wound, which was closing from the inside out. The tissue was reforming layer by layer, the process visible and ongoing. He also saw something else, something that was not part of her biology. Small, roughly the size of a rice grain, embedded against the outer edge of her left ilium, dense enough to be metallic and pulsing. A tracker, or something worse. She saw his face when he looked at the wand screen, and she said something, 2 syllables, sharp and flat. She looked at her own side. She said the same 2 syllables again, differently. Her hand moved toward the spot and then stopped, because her fingernail touched the spot from outside and she flinched and went very still, the way you go still when something hurts past a certain threshold. It wasn't just a tracker. "Yeah," Kane said. "I see it. I'm going to take it out. I need you to understand that's going to hurt, and I need you to let me do it anyway." She looked at him for a long time. He held the look. It was the only vocabulary he had. She turned her face away from him, presenting her left side, and went still. He worked fast and as clean as he could. The local anesthetic from the kit was pharmaceutical grade, meant for humans, and he had no idea how it would interact with her biology. He chose not to use it. If it paralyzed her circulatory system or triggered some response he couldn't predict, he'd have a worse problem than the pain. He irrigated the site, made the smallest incision he could, and went in with the forceps. She made 2 sounds during the extraction, not screams, not even cries, something lower and more controlled, sounds that came from the chest, and then it was out. The device was a sphere about 4 millimeters across, and it was still pulsing, active, transmitting. Kane set it on the floor of the truck and pressed his boot heel down on it. The pulse stopped. She let out a breath that seemed to go on longer than any human breath should. And then she turned and looked at him, and said something that he would spend the next 4 days trying to parse and eventually identify, with her help and a great deal of patience on both sides, as something close to, "I didn't think anyone would break it." Her name, as close as his vocal apparatus could produce it, was something like Vera. She accepted that. They drove north. The problem with heading north was that Kane didn't have a plan further than get out of the impact corridor before dawn. He had a disgraced scientist's instinct for what not to do. Do not call official channels. Do not go to a facility with government ties. Do not use his registered credit card. And a field researcher's ability to improvise the rest. Vera sat in the back seat and watched the desert go by, and Reyes drove without speaking, and Kane ran through everything he knew about extraterrestrial biology in the abstract while trying to observe a living subject in the particular. She was nitrogen-based. The pod confirmed that. Earth's atmosphere, 78% nitrogen, 21% oxygen, was apparently tolerable for her in the short term, though he noticed she breathed less frequently than he did and more deeply. She was bipedal, bilaterally symmetric, warm to the touch. The self-healing was the thing that stopped him every time he tried to think past it. He'd theorized about adaptive biology in his JPL work. Self-directed cellular repair wasn't impossible. It just required an energy source and a biological architecture radically more complex than anything Earth evolution had produced. She had both. And she'd been imprisoned precisely because of it, kept alive in suffering because she couldn't die of her wounds, which made her an infinitely renewable resource for whatever punishment her captors had designed. Who were her captors? That question got answered at 2 a.m. when 3 vehicles appeared on the highway behind them, running without lights, moving at a speed that the highway couldn't explain. "They found us," Reyes said, flat, not a question. Kane looked back. The vehicles were closing fast, not shaped like anything in a domestic automotive registry. Flat, wide, low to the ground, moving with the efficiency of something that wasn't fighting the road, just crossing it. Vera saw them. Every muscle in her body changed register simultaneously, going from conservation stillness to a different kind of still, predator still or cornered still, and the distinction mattered enormously. She said something fast and short. "They're the ones who put you in the pod," Kane said. Not a question either. She looked at him, then at the vehicles. Then she said something slower, and he caught a word he'd heard before, the 2 syllables she'd said when he'd found the device in her side. Same flat, sharp sound. "More devices," he guessed. "More of what was in you." Her expression confirmed it before she could form words. Whatever these beings had embedded in her, the tracker, the pain mechanism, they could do it at range. They were coming to collect her, and collection was not going to be comfortable. Raise, Kane said. I see them. How fast can this thing go? Faster than it looks. It turned out to be true. They were in a modified survey truck that Raise had personally maintained for 6 years and had once, under circumstances he didn't fully explain, driven across a dry lakebed at 130 miles per hour. He drove now with the same total focus, and the highway became a white line in the dark, and for 40 minutes they held the gap. But the gap was closing, not fast but steadily. The vehicles behind them didn't seem to need to worry about fuel or road conditions or physics in the way that the truck did. Vera in the back had stopped watching out the rear window. She was looking at Kane. She said something and he understood the rhythm of it, the shape of what she was saying before he understood any word. She was describing something, a property, a weakness. He'd spent 3 years being the expert that nobody listened to. He was good at parsing information that wasn't delivered in his native format. You know something about them, he said, something that can stop them. She pointed at the door of the truck. The door had a metal frame. She touched the metal with her fingertip, and then she touched the window, and then she made a gesture he didn't understand. She repeated it. He watched her face while she repeated it, the focus on it, the precision, and he thought, she is trying to tell me something specific, not something general. Not just metal, a specific property of this metal. Conductive, he tried, reflective. Neither word meant anything to her. He tried again. She made the gesture a third time, and this time he caught it. She touched the metal, then ran her finger along the window seal, which was rubber. She was distinguishing between them. Then she made a motion with her closed fist that could mean many things. Kane opened the glove box. Raise kept the truck stocked the way field researchers keep trucks stocked, everything that might conceivably be needed, in no particular order. His hand closed on a bottle of selenium supplement powder, the kind you got at the outdoor supply store for extended desert exposure work, because selenium deficiency was a real risk at altitude. It was a yellow and white bottle with a picture of a mountain on it. He held it up. Vera's entire face changed. It wasn't recognition. It was something sharper than recognition. It was relief, the way relief looks when it's been compressed under a very long wait and suddenly has permission to exist. She reached for the bottle and turned it in her hands and said one word twice. Selenium, Kane said, C. Atomic number 34, group 16 chalcogen. He had no idea which of those things she recognized. But she recognized one of them, because she looked at the bottle and then at the vehicles behind them and then at Kane, and the look was different from anything she'd given him before. It was the look of someone who has been looking for an answer to a problem for a very long time and has just found it in the last place they expected. The truck crested a rise and the road ahead opened into the flatlands. Far to the right, maybe 2 miles out, was the cluster of lights that marked the outer edge of a town, not a large one, but large enough to have a fire station, which meant a ladder truck, which meant a pressurized hose line that could move volume. Raise had already seen it. He was already turning. Tell me what you need, Kane said to Vera. She pointed at the bottle. Then she made the motion again, the fist, which he now understood differently. Not explosive, distributed, dispersed. She needed it spread, needed it in contact with them, not thrown at them, in their atmosphere, in their bodies. Suspended in water, pumped at volume. The fire station, Kane said. I know, said Raise. The fire station had 3 vehicles and 2 personnel on night shift, and those 2 personnel were a veteran named Doris and a trainee named Wheeze who had been failing his agility tests for 4 months and showed up for every shift anyway on the basis that he was going to get it eventually. When a modified survey truck skidded into the station bay with no warning at 2:40 a.m., Doris's first instinct was to reach for the radio, and Wheeze's first instinct was to grab a wrench. And Kane was already out of the truck with his Federal Survey credentials, and an explanation he was condensing to the absolute minimum on the way through the bay door. "I know how this sounds," he said. "I know exactly how this sounds. I need your ladder truck and your largest bore discharge hose, and I need 20 minutes, and I need both of you to stay inside until I tell you it's over." Doris stared at him, then at Vera, who had come in behind him, barefoot, still bleeding slightly through the improvised bandage on her side, with the focused calm of someone who has decided to bet everything on a single course of action. "She's not from around here," Doris said. It was the same thing Reyes had said. Kane found it briefly funny. "No," he said, "she's not. And the things behind us aren't either, and they're about a mile out. I have a compound that kills them and a delivery mechanism question, and I need a high-volume pump. That's all I need." Doris looked at Vera for a long moment. Vera looked back at her. Something passed between them that Kane couldn't read and didn't try to. "Bay 2, Doris said. "We's get the line." What Kane had was 3 pounds of selenium supplement powder, and the understanding, arrived at in the last 10 minutes of the drive, that what he needed was suspension, not solution. Selenium powder suspended in water at high volume, propelled at pressure, dispersed as an aerosol into the area of engagement. He knew almost nothing about the specific biochemistry of Vera's captors except what he could extrapolate. They were adapted to a nitrogen-heavy atmosphere. They were not from Earth. Their biology had the same general nitrogen base that Vera's did. If selenium was toxic to them, and Vera's response to the bottle suggested it was, the mechanism was probably the same mechanism that made selenium toxic to nitrogen-based microorganisms in Earth biology. It substitutes for sulfur in protein synthesis, inserting itself into biological processes and corrupting them at the molecular level. You didn't need much. You needed it in the right place. He mixed the suspension in the truck's spare water tank, 3 pounds of powder to 40 gallons of water, a ratio he arrived at by calculation and hope. We's connected it to the discharge manifold under Reyes's direction. Doris had quietly moved both of them to the back of the station. Vera was standing at the bay door, watching the dark outside. The 3 vehicles had stopped at the edge of the station's light radius, roughly 200 yards out, and Kane, coming up beside her, understood why. They were assessing. They were smart enough to assess. Whatever Vera was to them, she was worth collecting carefully, not just overwhelming. They would not have tracked the device's last location to a fire station without understanding that the fire station represented a change in circumstances. They were deciding how to proceed. Kane had maybe 4 minutes. "I need to explain something to you," he said to Vera. "What I'm about to do, the way I'm going to disperse this, the hose has range, but not 200 yards of range at the pressure we have. I need them closer. And I don't know how to make them come closer except one way." She looked at him, he looked at her. "Me," he said. "I go out there, without the compound. They come forward to retrieve you or to retrieve me to question about you, and they come into range." She said something quick and flat, objection clearly. "I know," he said. "It's a stupid plan, but I was the second-best xenobiologist at JPL before somebody stole my work, and I am not going to let the planet get colonized by beings who bury princesses to their necks in the desert and leave them to suffer. That's a personal position. I'm allowed to have those." She stared at him for a moment. Then she did something he hadn't seen her do before. She pressed the back of her 4-fingered hand against his chest, not pushing, not restraining, holding, a gesture that he understood without translation as, "I see you." Not, "Don't go," not, "I forbid it," just, "I see what you're doing, I am marking it." He walked out. The air outside was desert-cool, dry, very still. He walked toward the vehicles at a pace that was not a run but was not slow, the pace of someone who knows where they're going and is going there. The vehicles picked up his approach on whatever they used for sensors, and he saw movement near the closest one, a door opening, a figure emerging. He'd expected something more overtly alien. What he got was humanoid in shape, bipedal, taller than him by nearly a foot, with a proportional structure similar to Vera's but different in ways he couldn't process quickly because he was focused on walking and breathing and not stopping. The figure moved toward him with deliberate slowness, the way you move toward something you intend to collect. Behind Kane, the fire station bay door was still open. The ladder truck's engine was running. He could hear it. "Hey," Kane said when the figure was 50 feet from him. He stopped walking. "You should know I'm not going to tell you where she is. I know that's probably why you're interested in me. But I want you to understand that I'm offering you a choice, and I want you to think carefully about it, because I had a very specific career trajectory before this evening, and I would like to get back to something like it eventually." The figure stopped. It tilted its head. Kane couldn't see features, but he could see the shape of attention. "She asked me not to do this," he said. "For what it's worth, that's the kind of person she is." He didn't have a signal. He didn't have a radio. What he had was the understanding that Reyes, who had been running field operations in difficult terrain for a decade, would be watching from the bay door and would know what Kane starting to walk backward meant. Kane started to walk backward. The vehicles moved, not fast, controlled. They came forward into the light radius, and Kane was moving backward and the station bay was behind him, and the ladder truck's engine was very loud now, and the high-arc monitor on the truck's roof swept forward. The discharge opened. The sound was tremendous. Water and suspension under 250 psi through a 4-inch bore line described a specific acoustic event, a sustained roar with the quality of weather. The cloud of selenium water suspension went out at range and spread. It was not targeted. It was blanket coverage of an area. The effect was not immediate. Kane had expected it might not be. Biochemical processes take time, even when disrupted. He was 12 feet from the bay door, and the cloud was settling over the vehicles and the figures near them, and there was silence from that direction for 4 seconds. Then there wasn't. He didn't look back when he ran. He didn't need to. The sounds from the vehicles were definitive, not explosions, but the kind of cascade biological failure made when it was loud enough. He got inside. Reyes had the discharge running for another 40 seconds until the tank was empty, sweeping left to right. Then it was quiet. The 3 vehicles stood in the lot, stationary, no movement near or in them. Kane stood in the bay and breathed. Vera was beside him. She had been beside him since he cleared the door, and she had her hand, just her fingertips, resting very lightly on his arm. The sun came up approximately 3 hours later, in the aggressive way it comes up over Arizona desert, no gradual warming, just a sudden declaration of light across the whole sky. Kane sat on the station steps with a cup of Doris's coffee and watched it. Vera sat beside him. She had accepted half the cup and held it in her 4-fingered hands and looked at the horizon. He didn't know what would happen next. He had a realistic understanding of his position. He had destroyed government-adjacent property, conducted an unauthorized xenobiological field operation, made first contact with an extraterrestrial entity without following any of the 19 protocols that existed for that scenario, and had done all of it in front of 3 witnesses who would eventually talk to somebody. The machinery of official response was going to arrive, and it was going to be substantial. He was surprisingly okay with that. "The ones that came for you," he said, "are there more?" Vera considered this. She had, over the past several hours, developed a working system for communicating with him that involved more gesture than word and more expression than either. She understood that he was asking about scope. She tilted her open hand flat, parallel to the ground, held it, then tipped it, not a lot but enough. "More but not unlimited." "And you," he said, "are you," he searched for the word, the category, "are you important to them, to your people? Is there someone looking for you from your side?" She was quiet for a long time. Then she said something slow and deliberate, 5 syllables, spaced the way you space things when you want to make sure they're understood correctly. He couldn't parse it word by word, but the shape of it, the way she held his gaze when she said it, and the slight shift in how she held her shoulders, the shape of it was something like, "I was, and now I'm something different because of this." He supposed that was probably true for both of them. The coffee was bad. He drank it anyway. She tried another sip, made a face that was the clearest human expression she'd produced so far, and handed the cup back. Reyes came out of the bay behind them, drying his hands. He looked at the 3 vehicles in the parking lot, already sinking a few inches into the desert floor, whatever mechanisms had kept them mobile apparently offline, and he looked at Kane and Vera and he said, "So, what do we tell people?" "The truth," Kane said. Reyes raised an eyebrow. "Which part?" "All of it. Starting with the part where the government classified my work and put me in a corner of the desert to count rocks, and how that particular decision resulted in exactly the wrong person being in exactly the right place to handle a situation they were going to hear about whether they liked it or not." Reyes was quiet for a moment. "Then, you're going to make a lot of enemies." "I already have a lot of enemies. What I didn't have was a story they couldn't bury." He looked at Vera. She was watching the sun come all the way up over the rim of the basin, and her profile against it was, he searched for a word and settled on composed. Patient. The expression of someone who has been through the worst of something and has come out the other side with their dignity intact, which he suspected required an enormous amount of work to maintain. "I'm not interested in keeping secrets that other people get to define." She turned and found him looking at her. She said something short. 2 words, maybe 3, it was getting easier to count them. Her chin lifted very slightly. He didn't need a translation for that one. He'd seen that expression on the faces of field scientists, of academics who'd been pushed out of rooms that should have stayed open, of people who'd spent years being told their subject matter didn't exist. It was the expression of someone reclaiming the right to be documented. "Yeah, he thought me too." Doris came out with a second pot of coffee, took one look at the alien vehicles slowly dissolving in the parking lot, and said, "I'm going to need a lot more coffee." "Probably," Kane said. "And somebody needs to call the state fire marshal's office." "Also probably." She poured. They sat. The desert did what deserts do. It ignored all of them, and went on being ancient and indifferent and oddly beautiful. The way things are beautiful when they've been around long enough to stop worrying about what anyone thinks of them. Vera accepted a second cup. She did not make a face this time. In the weeks that followed, the situation was exactly as complicated as Kane had expected and exactly as manageable as he'd gambled it might be. Because the thing about being the wrong person in the right place with the right knowledge is that it is very difficult to quietly discredit. Colonel Staves arrived with 2 other officials and a legal framework and an intent to classify everything, and Kane sat across from them in a conference room and put 12 years of suppressed scientific documentation on the table, and Vera sat beside him, and Reyes sat on her other side, and Doris sat at the end because she'd driven 6 hours to be there, and nobody was going to stop her. The legal framework took about 4 minutes to become implausible. What remained after the legal framework was a negotiation, and Kane was good at negotiations because he had spent years being bad at them and had identified every mistake he'd made. He knew what he wanted: formal recognition of the xenobiological contact event, reinstatement of his research program under civilian oversight, and access to the 3 vehicles in the parking lot for analysis. He knew what they wanted: control of the narrative and a quiet solution to the problem of Vera. They reached a compromise. These things usually did. Vera's people arrived 11 days after the contact event, not her captors, who were not in a position to arrive anywhere anymore, but her people, the ones who had been looking for the ejected pod for 6 days before Kane had found it. They came in a way that was announced rather than concealed, because Vera had been in contact with them through a method Kane still didn't fully understand, and she had described the situation in terms that apparently caused her people to choose transparency over confrontation. They were, he had no other word for it, impressed. Not by Kane specifically, though he got the sense he registered as unusual. By the selenium. By the decision to use a fire hose. By the willingness of 3 humans and a trainee firefighter to stand in a parking lot at 2:40 a.m. and pump antidandruff compound at vehicles that scared them. By the specific quality of human response to a situation where the correct answer was not immediately obvious, and where most species, in the same position, would have made a different choice. The xenobiologist who accompanied Vera's diplomatic delegation spent 40 minutes asking Kane questions, and Kane spent 40 minutes answering them. And at the end, the xenobiologist said something that Vera translated, haltingly, imprecisely, with the careful architecture of someone working between 2 grammars, as approximately, "Your species is not what we were told to expect." "What were you told?" Kane asked. Vera translated his question. The xenobiologist responded. Vera translated the response, and her voice had something in it that he recognized as the closest thing to amusement he'd heard from her. "Small," she said, "slow, probably no threat." Kane considered this for a moment. The coffee in his cup was going cold, and outside the window the desert was doing what it always did, going on, indifferent, ancient, beautiful. "To be fair," he said, "I was absolutely no threat until I was." Vera relayed this. The xenobiologist said something long and multi-layered. Around the table, the diplomatic delegation made a sound together, a coordinated resonance, low and warm, that Kane's pattern recognition eventually identified as laughter. He drank his cold coffee and let them laugh. It was a good sound. It was the kind of sound that meant something would come next. He was already making notes. The formal xenobiological contact documentation that Kane submitted ran to 214 pages, which was the most anyone had submitted for a first contact event in history, partially because there had been no prior first contact events, and partially because Kane had been taking notes since the moment the pod opened and had not stopped. The military liaison, a man named Carver who had the specific quality of person who'd been told to manage a situation rather than understand it, read 30 pages, and then set the rest aside and asked Kane to summarize. "No," Kane said. Carver blinked. "Excuse me. I spent 8 years doing work that was summarized by someone else, and the summarization removed everything important. Read the document or don't, but I'm not summarizing it for you." Vera, across the table, watched this exchange with the attention she gave everything total and very still. She had been learning English with a speed that unnerved people who weren't paying close attention to the mechanism. She was not learning it the way humans learned second languages, which was essentially by accumulation of pattern. She was learning it the way a very sophisticated system processes an input stream, pulling structure from context, applying pattern recognition to every exchange, running comparisons between what she heard and what she observed simultaneously. 6 days in, she had working comprehension of somewhere between 60 and 70% of conversational English, and Kane suspected the gaps were less about vocabulary and more about idiom. She had also, at some point in those 6 days, started to be amused by him. It showed up in small ways, a slight change in the set of her mouth when he said something that apparently registered as either strange or typical, a particular tilt of the head when he was being what she probably recognized as stubborn. He didn't know how she categorized it, but he recognized the quality because he'd seen it in other people who found him professionally exasperating. It was the face of someone deciding you were more interesting than irritating. He chose to consider that progress. The documentation was important to him for a reason beyond professional instinct, though professional instinct was part of it. What had happened in that basin? From the moment he'd knelt over the moving sand to the moment the 3 vehicles had gone silent in the station lot, was the kind of event that was going to be defined by whoever defined it first. Kane knew this from experience. The paper that didn't get published, the protocol that got reclassified, the name removed from a citation, these were not accidents. They were decisions made by people who understood that in the absence of a clear record, the record got written by whoever was loudest or most official. He was not going to let this one get written by Colonel Staves's office. "What is she, specifically?" Carver asked, looking at Vera in the way that people looked at things they were trying to categorize with insufficient information. "She's a person," Kane said. "Specifically a person from somewhere that isn't here. Every other specific thing I know about her is in the document." Vera's chin did the small upward tilt. "I mean," Carver gestured vaguely. "Position, role, is she a civilian, a military?" "She was transported in a restraint device by individuals who are no longer in a position to be asked about their intentions. If you want to know her political designation, you'll need to wait for the translation protocol to develop enough to discuss it. That's in Chapter 11. Carver picked up Chapter 11. That night Kane was sitting on the steps of the government facility they'd been assigned, a converted research station outside Flagstaff. Nobody's idea of comfortable but functional, when Vera came and sat beside him. She'd been doing this since the fire station, he'd noticed. Not constantly, not in a way that seemed like she needed company. More like checking, arriving, sitting for a while, leaving. He thought of it as reconnaissance of a trusted position. The stars over northern Arizona were catastrophic in the best way. No light pollution this far out, and the Milky Way was a physical presence overhead rather than a concept. Vera looked up at them for a long time. "Yours," Kane said, gesturing upward. She looked at the stars, looked at him. Then she raised one 4-fingered hand and pointed, not at a single star but at a region, a direction. Her arm was at about 40 degrees above the horizon, and she held it steady. "Far?" he asked. She considered the word. He could see her working with it. Then she made a gesture he'd seen before, the flat hand, parallel to the ground, moving forward steadily with neither hurry nor pause. Distance that didn't feel like distance, maybe, or distance that was real but not limiting. He wasn't sure. "We'll figure out the language," he said. She lowered her arm. She said something and he caught 3 words, 2 he recognized and 1 he didn't. The 2 he recognized were the equivalents of find and take. The 1 he didn't was probably important. The rhythm of the sentence put the unknown word in the position of the thing being found and taken. He added it to the log he kept in his head between writing sessions. "What they did to you," he said, "in the pod, the device in your side." He paused. He'd been working toward this question for days and hadn't managed it yet. "Was it because of what you are, or what you know, or—" She made a sound, not a word, an interruption, the kind that means "I'll handle this part." She was quiet for a moment, assembling something. When she spoke, it was deliberate. English words placed carefully, with gaps where she didn't have the term. "Because," she said, "what I can do." She made the gesture for her healing, the small motion toward her own side. "They want it, not me. The process. The making again." Cellular regeneration, Kane thought. They wanted the mechanism. Her body as a subject of extraction, not a subject of any other kind. "And when you wouldn't give it to them?" She didn't answer that directly. She touched the healed side of her ribcage, just briefly, with her fingertips. Then she looked back at the stars. "He didn't push." "For what it's worth," Kane said, "the paper I'm writing includes a full description of the regenerative process as I observed it in the field, with your permission and your review before submission, which means it gets documented on terms that include you as a participant, not a specimen." She turned her head and looked at him. That's the difference, he said, between science and what they were doing. You're allowed to know what gets written about you. She was quiet for a long time. Then she said one word that he was fairly certain by now was the rough equivalent of, yes, consent, agreement offered from a position of choosing, not compelled. Good, he said. Ray's came out with 2 cups of tea. Doris had apparently sent a care package and sat on the step below them without ceremony. Carver's on the phone with someone, he said. Sounds like Washington. It always is eventually, Kane said. You worried? Kane looked at the stars. I was worried when I was trying to be quiet about things, he said. I'm not sure I can be quiet about this one, which is either the problem or the solution. Historically, for you, it's been both. Yes. That's also in the document. Vera accepted a cup of tea. She looked at it for a moment. Then she tried it. Her expression did the thing, not quite human expression, not quite readable, and then it settled into something that might, on a human face, have been cautious approval. Better than the coffee, Kane said. She looked at him. She said the word for coffee that she'd learned at the fire station. She'd been adding it to exchanges in ways that he was pretty sure meant she had developed an opinion about it. Yes, he agreed, much better than the coffee. Ray's drank his tea. Kane drank his tea. Vera drank hers. The stars did what stars do over the Arizona desert, which is go on being ancient and numerous and indifferent to questions of jurisdiction. The negotiations, and they became formal negotiations, because once Vera's people arrived in a visible way, there was no path to treating it otherwise, lasted 3 weeks. Kane sat in on all of them, which was not his formal role but which nobody seemed willing to argue about, possibly because Vera had made it clear that she considered his presence non-negotiable, and her people had made it clear that Vera's positions were respected. Carver spent a lot of those 3 weeks being visibly unsettled. Kane spent them learning 200 words of Vera's language and documenting everything in real time. What emerged from the negotiations was not a treaty, too early for that, too many things still unknown on both sides. What it was an agreement about approach. An agreement that the contact would be maintained through a joint scientific working group rather than through any military channel, and that the working group would be led, on the human side, by whoever had demonstrated the most effective first contact methodology. This was, apparently, a formal designation in Vera's people's diplomatic architecture. The person who conducted the contact defined the framework. You're going to end up running something, Reyes told him, the night after the framework was signed. I'm going to end up running the thing I was supposed to be running 6 years ago, Kane said. Before they gave it to someone else. And Staves. Staves is going to have to explain why the classified atmospheric analysis protocol he published was the protocol that got us here, which is either awkward for him or useful for me, depending on how the paper gets cited. You're really going to spend the rest of your career citing yourself through someone else's name. I'm going to spend the rest of my career not being buried, Kane said. How I get there is a detail. On the last night before Vera's people's first formal departure, they would return regularly through an agreed channel. She found him in the small office that had become his working space, surrounded by the specific organized chaos of a scientist in active documentation. Notes on every surface. 3 separate laptops. A whiteboard with linguistic mapping that had run off the edge twice and been continued on butcher paper. She stood in the doorway for a moment. Then she came in and stood behind him and looked at the whiteboard. He turned his chair. Tell me what I got wrong, he said. She studied the board. She reached past him and picked up a marker. She'd been doing this increasingly, adding to his maps, correcting structural errors in the grammar analysis. She drew 2 lines connecting words he'd isolated and crossed out one connection he'd made, and added a notation at the bottom in her own writing system, which was angular and dense, and he'd been mapping separately. "What's that say?" he asked, pointing at her notation. She considered. Then in English, careful. "When you don't know the shape of a thing, you draw it anyway to find out." He looked at her notation, at the whiteboard full of incomplete language maps and linguistic guesses, at the 3 laptops and the butcher paper. "That's most of science," he said. She looked at the whiteboard for another moment. Then she said something in her own language, long, structured, the kind of sentence she used when she wanted to be precise. He caught maybe 40% of it, which was progress. He wrote the parts he caught into the log. He'd fill in the gaps later with her help. "You'll come back," he said, "when they do." She turned and looked at him. Her expression was the composed, patient one, the one that had been there when he'd first seen her face above the resin, when she was buried to her neck and could not move and was being very careful not to show anything that could be used against her. Except it was different now. The composure was the same, but the weight behind it was different. It was not the controlled patience of endurance. It was the deliberate patience of something chosen. She said one word. He had it in the log. He knew what it meant. "Yes." He drove her to the departure point in the same truck Ray's had driven through the Arizona dark. The morning was cold and clear, the kind of cold that made the desert feel provisional, like it was tolerating human presence while it thought about more important things. Vera sat in the passenger seat this time, and he drove, and nobody talked until he pulled up at the coordinates. There was a vehicle waiting. One of hers, not like the 3 that had dissolved in the fire station lot which had been her captor's design, functional and harsh. This one had different lines, different quality. It sat on the desert floor like it was deciding whether to become something else. She got out of the truck. He got out too, because it seemed wrong to stay in the seat. She stood in the desert with the early sun behind her, and she was tall and composed, and the wound on her side was fully closed now, the skin smooth over it, no evidence that it had ever been open. She looked at him for a moment. Then she raised her hand, 4 fingers, and pressed the back of it against his chest, above the sternum. The same gesture from the fire station. "I see you." He pressed his own hand over hers for a moment. She let it stay. "I'll have the first paper ready when you come back," he said, "for your review." Her chin tilted up, the expression that was probably amusement that he had decided to take at face value. She walked to the vehicle. He watched it lift, not rocket thrust, not propellant, something quieter and more final, a separation from gravity that looked like a choice rather than a mechanism. It was gone before the sound of it caught up. The desert was very quiet. Kane stood there for another minute, letting the morning do what mornings do. Then he went back to the truck and opened his field notebook to a fresh page and wrote the date at the top, and below it the one word she'd said, transcribed as closely as he could manage in 2 writing systems simultaneously. Someday the gap between them would be smaller. He was going to spend the time between now and then making sure the record was accurate. He wrote, she called it a beginning. He put the truck in gear and drove toward Flagstaff, toward the office full of papers, toward the arguments and the negotiations and the very long work of being in contact with something genuinely new. He realized, not thinking about Colonel Staves. He was thinking about Chapter 12, which needed restructuring. He turned on the radio. Some old country song he didn't know, playing through static from a station that was either in New Mexico or in a different era entirely. He drove with the window down, and the cold air moved through the truck, and somewhere at 40 degrees above the horizon, a ship that was not made anywhere on Earth was making its way back to whatever constituted home. The song played through. He didn't sing along, but he hummed it just a little, not consciously, the way you hum things when your mind is somewhere else entirely and your body is doing something it knows how to do. That was the thing about humans, he thought. The things they did when they weren't paying attention, the half gestures, the background noise of being alive. He suspected that, was what her people had found surprising. Not the selenium, not the fire hose, not even the willingness to stand in a parking lot in the small hours and face things they'd never seen before. The humming. The fact that even when everything was on the line, some part of the species just continued, kept the smaller rhythms going, the tunes their mothers sang, the cups of bad coffee, the notes on butcher paper. The assumption built so deep it didn't register as an assumption that there would be more. He drove. The desert went on. The static in the radio found the station again, and the song was still playing as if it had been waiting for him to catch up. He drove east into the light.